series of manoeuvres. In narrow terms, it was a very well executed coup, and it went according to the Tom Watson script. Right? Tom Watson was the one who organised the ousting of Blair back in 2006, using many of the same tactics. Well, you know, if your power is gained by forming alliances within the state, forming, good friendships and connections, networks with think tanks, businesses, and particularly the media, if that's where you get your power from, well, of course, then you are going to bloody resign because you haven't got anything else to back you up. But Jeremy Corbyn just happened to have a much broader conception of social and political power than they did. And so when they came for Jeremy Corbyn using these techniques, yes, it looked awful. It looked for a week like he might really have to go, like he might be bullied and blackmailed into doing it. But instead what he did was he said, the only strength that we on the left have ever had has been our numbers, our organisation, and our ideological clarity, right? A sense that we know what the stakes are and we have a broad strategic vision. And he appealed to the movement. And the movement responded. I mean, when I talk about the movement, I mean, we can talk about the movement in a very sentimental way. There isn't much sign of an actual movement, but let's just say that there is an audience. There is a sort of a radical left out there that can be summoned into a movement. And he appealed to people from the Labour left and from beyond the Labour left, and they turned out. And the result of that was, as you know, that he drew more people into the Labour Party, recruited, I think it was more than, it was at least 100,000, possibly more, new members and supporters into the Labour Party in a very short space of time. And put the sort of coup merchants on the back foot. And once they were put on the back foot, it was very clear that they didn't have anything. They didn't have a usurper. They hadn't agreed on who their candidate would be. Turned out it was somebody who made cock jokes for a living and told women they should put gobstoppers in their mouths because, you know, evidently they're too mouthy. That's the idea. So they got someone who was a sort of sexist joker who didn't have a clear alternative. Essentially, who didn't even dare to agree on the fundamentals of policy with Jeremy Corbyn, just presented himself as somebody who had essentially the same ideas but was a bit safer and a bit more media friendly. So they didn't have a political alternative, they didn't have an alternative candidate, and above all, and this is something that the Blairites have started to acknowledge, they didn't have any answers to the crisis of Labour. Because the crisis of Labour is not new, and it wasn't invented by Jeremy Corbyn, and there is a crisis. The crisis of Labour is something that's going back several decades, and you can look at it like this. New Labour was the first attempt to answer that crisis seriously from the right, and it attempted to answer that crisis by turning social democracy into something else, something we sometimes call social liberalism, essentially a neoliberalised social democratic party. Corbyn is doing it from the left. It represents the first attempt to address the crisis of social democracy from the left. And it's not really clear what that actually means in practice, what Labourism is to become. But it so happens, quite by chance, and we have done nothing to deserve this, but we could end up with, indeed we seem to be ending up with, a mass left-wing Labour Party with parliamentary representation and trade union backing. In other countries, they've had to have a split from social democracy, a radical left party being formed, usually getting around 10% of the vote, not really getting much union backing, struggling, and so on. And somehow in this country, despite everything, despite all the failures of the left, despite all the weaknesses of the left, we end up, just because of the sheer calamitous incompetence of the traditional political guard and management, we end up potentially with this mass left-wing political organisation. And that is wide open for the future in terms of the struggle. And it's, if you want to talk about concretising how we sort of implement a possible transition away from not just neoliberal capitalism, but capitalism as such, it seems to me that the first step has to be what happens to the Labour Party, because all of our fates depends on that. I'll leave it there. Thank you.